cells.
Okay, let's start to look at Ruby. So, Ruby was created by this guy, Yukihiro Matsumoto, which I'm sure I'm butchering the way that I'm saying his name, so forgive me for that. So I really like this quote from him that says, "I hope to see Ruby help every programmer in the world to be productive and to enjoy programming and to be happy. That is the primary purpose of the Ruby language." So I really like that. He really did invent this language for programmers with the idea that he wanted it to be easy to program in Ruby and to make programmers happy to use. So for a lot of people it does that, and for some people it doesn't. There are criticisms of Ruby, and there are people who really, really like Ruby, and that's going to be true with everything, right? So there is an interactive Ruby shell, and if you have Ruby installed on your machine, which I think everyone does, even if it's not quite at the right level yet, you can open up a terminal on your machine. Ruby didn't install for you? So what do you have right now when you did?
It pops up nothing. It showed that it was installing or whatever when I did these names, but it doesn't give me a version.
So if you do RVM list, what do you see?
Default Ruby not selling.
Right. And if you say which Ruby?
It says current and default and default.
Okay. Okay. If you type which space Ruby, does it give you a path? WHICH Ruby. Does it show a path or does it show nothing? Does it show nothing? All right. Okay, so I think everyone else has Ruby installed. So if you open up a terminal and you run IRB, that will open the interactive Ruby shell. So you can use the interactive Ruby shell to type Ruby code. You type Ruby code right in there. To get out of this interactive shell, you type exit, and you'll leave the interactive shell. So you'll see me use IRB in class to try things out. So if there's something that I want to see, is this going to do what I think it does? Does this method do what I think it does? Then I'll try it out in IRB. Yes?
So is this a way you can test your code?
It is a way you can test code sort of a line at a time.
So is it any specific code, or is it all code?
You can use it to, it runs Ruby. It runs Ruby. So anything Ruby, you can test in this. I wouldn't use it to test a whole program.
Yeah.
The way that I use Ruby, the way that I use IRB is to check my understanding of things, generally. Okay? So one of the things that's challenging for me as a programmer who's been programming for a long time in lots of different languages is I'll forget which syntax goes with which language. I'll forget which methods are defined on certain object types, so for string or for an array or for a hash, the methods that are defined across those basic object types can be slightly different between languages. So I'll forget if it's, called find or search or, something like that, and I'll forget syntax. And so I'll use the interactive shell for that language if it has one. So JavaScript has one too. It has a Node. You can use Node as an interactive shell environment. So I'll just fire up the interactive shell and I'll try it, and I'll see it, check my understanding, check the assumptions that I'm making, and I'll do that all the time. You'll see me do it in class. But it's also a handy way to just sort of get familiar with the language when it's new to you. And we'll use it that way in class too over the next couple of weeks. So when you run IRB, it actually creates this shell environment where the Ruby interpreter is running. Okay, so Ruby is an interpreted language rather than a compiled language. Some languages are compiled, and some languages are interpreted. A compiled language, we take the code that's written by the programmer, it runs through a compiler as a separate step, and the compiler spits out a different version of the code that's not human readable, and then that different version of the code can be executed in a particular environment. Yes, Jai?
Are you recording this lesson?
I am. Thank you for asking, though. Yeah, it's always, don't be afraid to ask me if I'm recording, because sometimes I might forget, so I appreciate the reminder. So Ruby is an interpreted language. So their interpreted languages don't have to be compiled as a separate step. There is an interpreter that runs on the system where this code is running, and the code runs through the interpreter, and the interpreter executes the code. So that's the case with Ruby. So you can use IRB like a calculator if you want to. It can do simple maths. So you can type in any kind of calculation, and it will give you the answer. So that's pretty handy. Sometimes I use IRB as a calculator rather than opening calculator on my machine, because I like using the command line and I always have terminals open. Yeah?
On your Raspberry Pi, I forget what language it is, but that also has it's also a feature of that, the Raspberry Pi 3.
Yeah.
What language do they use?
I'm not sure what's used with Raspberry Pi. Does anybody know? I can't remember.
ARM, but like anything really relevant.
Okay.
There's a default
Yeah.
language that it comes.
Is there a
It's
default?
ARM by IRB6, right?
Okay. So we can also define variables in IRB. So we can, who knows what a variable is? Yeah, what is a variable, Liam?
Just a placeholder where you can store data.
Yeah, it's a placeholder to store data. So a variable, we give it a name, a label, and then we can assign a value to the variable, and the way we do that is we say variable name or label equals and whatever value we want to give it. Now what we actually do, what actually happens when we do that in the computer is a space in memory, in computer memory, gets allocated. So this will be some address. It'll be some hexadecimal address in memory, this sort of space in memory that's going to be big enough to hold the information that that type of variable can hold, and it will store the data. So if we said sum equals 1 plus 5, then it would hold this value 6 in this place in memory. And this label sum would actually be a pointer to this address in memory. That's actually what's happening, okay? So we can change the value of what's assigned to sum. So we could say first sum equals 1 plus 5, and it would store 6 in memory. And then if we can say sum times 2, and it'll take the value that's currently stored in sum, which is 6, and multiply it by 2, and replace the value with 12. And so this label, this variable, is just pointing to that spot in memory, and we're changing what's stored in that spot in memory. Okay, that's what's happening behind the scenes. So the first line that we see on here is called an assignment. Okay, this is when we're assigning a value to a variable. This actually didn't do what I said here. What would we have to change there? Because all we did was we said sometimes 2, but we didn't actually store it in anything. If we wanted it to actually store it back into sum, what would I have to do?
Equals again. Sometimes.
I would have to do that, and then it would do this. Then it would change that 6
And that can
to
just go
12.
up. You can just keep down sum equals.
You can just, yeah, you can keep changing sum and keep using the value that's currently stored in sum to change the value that's stored in sum. Now we can also type strings into IRB. So what's a string? Somebody tells me what a string is. Aiden?
Words.
It's words. It's just text. And we denote a string with quotes. That's how we denote that this value is a string, as we put it in quotes. And it could be single quotes, or it could be double quotes. But in Ruby, we tend to use double quotes. And that's so we can do what's done in this slide here, which is called interpolation. That's a big fancy word. Interpolation. What interpolation is when we reference a variable or a piece of Ruby code inside of a string, and we reference it with this very special notation, this hash sign and the curly brackets, and then what is inside that hash sign and curly brackets will be interpreted by the Ruby interpreter and will be replaced with what the interpreter interprets it as. So if you take off the hash sign and the curly braces, and the interpreter is reading some will interpret it as whatever's stored here. So if we have a 6 stored for sum right now in memory, then this is going to be interpreted as 6. And when we print it out, we'll see the sum is 6. This will be replaced with what's interpreted. Okay? Now, string interpolation only works if we have double quotes. It doesn't work if there are single quotes. So you can define a string in Ruby with single quotes, but you can't use it to do string interpolation. Okay? So we'll have a play with this in IRB in a minute. So we've talked about 2 data types so far. What's the one that we just talked about? String. And what's the one that we were talking about with sum? What data type is sum holding? It's a number. For now, we're just going to say number, and we won't get into the details of what kind of number it is. A variable isn't a data type. A variable is just a placeholder. Yeah, a placeholder for a pointer to memory that is holding some value. A data type is what type of data, tells us what type of data is being stored by a variable or otherwise being referenced. So we've talked about 2 so far, string and number. Now, in the in IRB, if we type something that Ruby doesn't understand, then so it's not a data type that it recognizes. So if we typed in oops or any character, any letter, then Ruby says, okay, that's not a string because I know strings have quotes around them. And it's not a number because numbers aren't letters. It must be a variable or a method. It must be a variable or a method name because that's all that it could be. So if we haven't defined a variable or a method with that name, then we'll get an error. We'll get a name error specifically that says undefined local variable or method, oops. And it won't do anything with it. Okay? So if we want Ruby to interpret something as a string, we have to put quotes around it. If we want Ruby to deal with a variable or a method, we have to define it first. Okay? So we would have to define oops as a variable before we would refer to it like this. If you look back at this slide, why didn't it complain when we just typed sum here? It is a variable name, and Ruby knows it's a variable because we've initialized it. We've assigned something to it. When we assign something to a variable, we initialize it. Yeah, Chris?
Why does that put equal, right? That's rather than this as well.
Are you talking about this right here?
Yes.
This is just the syntax used by IRB. And what it does is when you type a line into IRB, if the next line it prints out is what is returned by that line.
And that's just it's returning. So
Yeah, it's just sort of, you can think of it as the return symbol that's used in IRB. So this will always tell you what was the basically the return or the evaluation result, what was interpreted from the previous line that was entered. So yeah, so the reason why we can type sum here is because we've assigned a value to sum. So now Ruby knows this is a variable because we've done an assignment. We've initialized that variable is another way to say that. We have to initialize variables in Ruby before we use them. You can't just refer to a variable that you haven't put an equals after and assign something to it. Even if you assign it an empty string or you assign it a nil, you have to assign it something to be able to use it in Ruby. Not all languages are like that. Some languages will let you use variables that you haven't defined, but Ruby will not let you do that. So, let's talk about the difference between these two things. Now remember that we're in IRB, and what I just explained is that every time you type something into IRB, it will do what you tell it to do, and then it will print the return value. So in this first case, we're just typing what? What are we typing there? What is that? A string. We're just typing a string, and I would call that a literal string. A string literal, okay? We're not giving it a variable, we're just typing a literal string. And Ruby will just interpret that and spit it back at us. Because if you just type a literal string, then that's what Ruby returns. That's what it evaluates as, just as exactly what we typed in. Does anybody know what puts does in Ruby? Aiden? It prints whatever you tell it. And it prints it with a new line character. So that's important to know. So puts prints whatever you pass to it with a new line character. So if I say puts hello world, it prints hello world with a new line. So we go to the next line, and puts returns nil. Okay? So puts is a method in Ruby. You pass it a string. It doesn't have to be a string, it can be a number too. And it prints out whatever you tell it to print with a new line, and it returns nil. Okay, let's have a little bit of a play in IRB. You can follow along with this. Ooh. So I'll pass this blog on to you guys. This is the blog post I've been waiting for from Kieran from the previous cohort. It's really good. It's really good. Yeah. So I'm going to ask that all of you read this blog post before you come back on Monday, okay? Because I think he really, really captured what it takes to do well in this course. He did a really good job of it. Okay, so from anywhere, it doesn't matter where you run IRB. Okay, it's not going to store anything on your system. It's just an interactive shell that you're running things in, so you can run it from anywhere. So if you just type IRB, then you'll get a prompt like this. It'll tell you the version of Ruby that's running IRB. And that's 001. I think that might be a line number. Let's see. So if I type a number, it'll just give me back that number. Okay? If I can use it like a calculator, and that's no problem. I can even type, some pretty fancy expressions into it. Like I can say 9 divided by 5 plus 32. And it'll do that for me. Now, 9 divided by 5, what is it telling me? 1. Is that what you expect?
It does the reference value.
It's doing...
You need to cast it as a float.
You need to cast it as a float. That's right. So Ruby, unlike some languages like JavaScript, treats every number as a float unless you tell it otherwise. Ruby will treat a number as an integer. So I said we talked about data type number, but within number there are integers And integers are whole numbers, positive or negative. Yes? Do you remember that from math? Integers are whole numbers, positive or negative. And there are floats, although they might be, I think they're called floats in Ruby. They might be called decimal. Let's see. I think they're called floats because I can say 9. Yeah. Yeah. So in Ruby, if you give it two things that it thinks are integers, then it's going to do integer math. Okay? So if you do a division, and the result of that division should be a decimal, which is another name for a float, then you have to cast the numbers that you're dividing to floats first. So, or divide by a float. Yeah, so if I said 9.0 divided by 5, or if I said 9 divided by 5.0, then I would get the float answer. So if any of the numbers involved in the calculation are a float, then Ruby will do decimal maths. Okay? So it'll give you the decimal. So that's something to know about Ruby and how it treats numbers. Now I can also just type a string into Ruby and it'll give me back the string. And I can say puts in a string and it'll print what I told it to print with a new line and give me back a nil. I can also say puts 3 and it'll print the number 3 and give me back a nil. And I can say also greeting equals hello. What is this? What am I doing here? So I'm creating a variable called with greeting, yeah, and I'm assigning it a what kind of data type? A string with the value hello, and I can say puts greeting. So I can pass a variable to puts, and it will interpret that variable. It'll expect it to be a variable. If I said puts hi, what do you think it's going to do? Yeah, why will it give me an error? That's right. It'll say no variable or method hi because I didn't put it in quotes, so it doesn't think it's a string. It's not a number, so it's going to assume it's either a variable or a method name. And if I haven't defined a variable or a method called hi, then it's going to give me a name error. Okay, so if you're ever running Ruby code and you get a name error, you'll know to look for somewhere that either you were trying to refer to a string and you didn't put quotes, or you're referring to a variable or a method that you haven't defined. Maybe you misspelled it. Maybe you forgot to initialize it. Okay? But that's what you want to look for when you see an error like this. A name error means that it's expecting that this is a variable or method that's been defined. Now, another cool thing about Ruby is that it is intrinsically object-oriented. Everything in Ruby is an object. Everything in Ruby is an object. So I can, for example, say 9, like I did earlier, 9.2_f. 2_f is what is 2_f? Does anybody know? What is that?
What?
It is, what is it called? That construct, what is that? It's a method. It's a method, right? And it's a method on the data type number. John?
What is the 2F do?
It changes the number to a float. Okay? So if I say 9.2f, it'll give me 9.0. So I can just call a method on a number in Ruby. Because in Ruby, everything is an object. Okay? Now I can even see what are the methods available to me on something by typing .methods. And it'll list all the methods that I could call on this thing. Okay? Which is kind of handy. This is another way I use IRB. If I don't want to go to the browser and look up the Ruby docs to see what are the methods available, now usually what I'll do is I'll say 9.methods.sort. What do you think that does? In alphabetical order. So it'll give me back all the methods, but sorted in alphabetical. Because look at these methods. They're like not in any particular order. If you were trying to look through that, you'd be like, it's too hard to find. But if you sort it, then you know at least it's in alphabetical order. So say, for example, I want to see, is there a method on number that will let me hit the negative, or see if it's negative, okay? Is there a method on number that will I can just call the method on this number, and it'll tell me if it's negative or not. And so I might say, okay, let me see if there's something called negative, and I look through here and I say, oh, there is. There's a method called negative with a question mark. And I know that in Ruby there's a convention that if a method name ends with a question mark, can anybody guess what that method returns? A Boolean. It returns true or false. It's like you're asking the question, are you negative? And it returns true or false. So in Ruby, if a method name ends with a question mark, you know that that method returns a true or a false. Okay? So that's pretty handy to know. I want to know what rectangular does. What does rectangular do?
Is there a way to type a say on part of a method and you really know
Okay. Say again?
Is there a way to like say search the method? So say you manage typing a type and like halfway down
Wait.
It's like search for.
say like you know what do you reckon? Say you wanted to look up a negative one, could you type that .NG?
Right, and have it search. There isn't anything like that I know of, Mitchell, but there may be you could write something like that. It wouldn't be hard, would it? It wouldn't, I mean, I don't think it would be too hard. That actually is a great idea for a terminal app project.
Yeah, so say you just wanted to show N.
That's such a good idea. Such a good idea. Really think about that for your terminal app, because that would be handy. Because normally what I would do is I would either use this and just kind of like scan through and trying to find it, or I would go to Google and I would look for the methods that are defined on that thing, and then you can search the page, right? So I might do that, but how handy would it be to have a little app that was running and you could just start to type a method name and it would give you all the things that match? That'd be awesome. It wouldn't be too hard to do. You just have to call methods on the data type that this object is, and then you could do your own sorting and do some matching, some string matching. That'd be good. Nice. So, so I can also say, where's instance? Okay, that's not super useful. Didn't like that. It expects arguments, right. So I can also, if I look at a string, so strings are really interesting in any programming language, okay? We'll do so many things. We'll just use strings like crazy when we're programming something, because for a few reasons. One reason is because anytime we're dealing with user input, we always deal with it as a string. So the input comes to us as a string, okay? And then we usually have to do something based on that input. And so we have to be able to intelligently interpret what the user tells us by typing something in and figure out what it is they're trying to tell us to do. And we'll use some string manipulation to do that. So we'll get a string back from them, and then maybe we have to look for words, or we're trying to match certain things about this user input. And so we use strings a lot. So you'll notice that string has a lot of methods, and that's because strings are really useful, and we want to be able to do a lot of different things with them. So there is a method. What do you think 2_s does? And that's not a method on string, it's a method on object. What do you think 2_s does? Yep, toString. There is a toStr. Let's see what that does. It might be an alias for 2s. Nope.
That adding to the string
There's also like 2_i and then 2_s.
Yeah, so 2_i. What do you think that does?
I remember learning about it when I
Does anybody have a, yeah, 2 integer. That's right. That's right.
So the two function, it just works as to turn it
It's
to
like a
whatever you want.
converter. Yeah, it's like a converter. So you can have a play in IRB, and you can try out some things in there. You can write anything that Ruby interpreter understands in IRB, and it will understand it.
What is R?
2R. I don't know.
It gave me ratio.
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 Okay.
Oh, I was guessing.
Yeah. No, that's a good guess.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So sometimes you can't tell just by the method name what it is. Sometimes you can. And so when you can't, then you go look at the docs. So if we do a search, so if you search Ruby string methods, then what I look for is the latest version of documentation for that object. Okay, so I would look at the 2.4.0 documentation for the class string. And then the way that you use these docs, because they're a little bit confusing for people, is on the left-hand side are all the methods. So this is the same list that you get when you type .methods in IRB, okay? But it's nice in alphabetical order, and it's linked to descriptions. So if we looked, for example, at 2R, it's to rational. There you go. So it returns a rational, which denotes the string form. So it'll give you the fraction form, the improper fraction form of a number. And it'll give you, this documentation is nice once you get used to seeing it, because it'll give you lots of examples, and it'll show you what you should expect.
So we actually try to pick each one of them and
Yes.
try to run it in IRB.
Yeah.
The understanding improves a lot.
Yeah, that's right. So Varsha just said when you're looking at this documentation, you could take each one of these examples, copy and paste into IRB, and see the output, and it might make it even more clear to you. So I really do like this documentation. At first I didn't, because it's just a bit strange to look at. You didn't like it either, did you?
I used to find okay, there's so much.
There is. But I like it. I think
Yeah,
it's
no.
quite nice.
So even I'm liking it now.
Mm.
Is
Yeah.
that their place in the in stack?
The slides? Yes, the slides are. Oh, this link? No. No, but look, the way that I get here, because I'll tell you why I get here the way that I did. So I just Googled Ruby string methods to get here. This is the reason I do that, because if you just go to RubyDoc, okay, if you just go to the main page,
I think in the challenges, then there are pointers to the
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is what you come to though. And then you're here and you're like, where do I go? What am I looking at? But then you can click on the 262 Core API. But then you're still like, this isn't what I wanted. But then under here are the class listings. Okay? So then from down here, you can get to string, and that'll take you to the page that we were just looking at.
We're using 2.6.
Most people are using 2.6. I think some people might have 2.5. Either one is okay. So you can go to, let's see if we just go to this. We can go here, and you just have to know that you have to scroll down to the class list, okay? To actually get to the documentation. And then you would look for the class that you're interested in, and then you can see the list of methods for that class.
Is there another option when you're going through the methods not to just sort them to like search if one exists, like methods search create one?
So are you talking about for a specific data type?
Like specific.
Yeah, so what I would do in that case is I would go to string, and then on here I would just do a search on the page. Yeah, that's what I would do.
You can't do it in the terminal.
No, from the terminal you can't. So that's what Mitchell was just talking about. He was asking me if you could, and I said, no, you should write a terminal app that does that, though, because that wouldn't be too hard to implement, and it would be nice. So, because I don't like to open a browser to go look for documentation either if I don't have to. You know, if I can just get to it right in the terminal, that's a lot nicer.
You get like hundreds of words. I'd like to just be like, search this word for this particular word.
Yeah, yes, and that would be nice. Okay, I will put this link in Slack for you, but honestly, it's really easy to get to from Google, like I just did. So get comfortable with looking at docs. You know, no matter what kind of programming we're doing, there's all the languages that we do in this class are heavily documented. You know, it's one of the reasons that we use these languages, but they're heavily documented because they're heavily used, which is the main reason that we teach these languages, is that they're heavily used. And you can tell how popular and how much a language is used by how much and how good the documentation is on it, right? So when there are lots of users, then there's much better documentation. So let's just go through some programming concepts. We've covered some of these already, just kind of talking. So look at syntax, data types, variables, operators, and flow control. So syntax. Does anybody know what syntax is? The way you write it? The formatting? Yep. Liam, do you have something different? Yeah. So the syntax is what the language expects, the rules that the language, the interpreter of the language expects us to follow so that it understands what we've written. So syntax includes things like whether or not we use curly braces, where we use parentheses, where we use semicolons, things like that. Okay, and every language has its own syntax, and they're all slightly different. How do we know what the beginning of a method is? How do we know where a method ends? That's a combination of syntax and semantics. It's probably more semantics. Semantics are the words that are associated with the language, the special words that are used in a language, words that have special meaning. How do we know where the end of the line is in the program? In some languages, we have to put a semicolon to denote that this is where the end of this line is. Where do we know? How do we know where the an if statement ends? In some languages, we use curly braces for that, and in other languages, we use words. So every language is different in syntax and semantics, and that's just how it is. And if you learn multiple languages, which you all should, because every programmer should know more than one language, you'll get confused about the syntax and semantics. You'll mix them up. You'll forget which syntax goes with this language. And that's totally okay, all right? Because you can easily look up syntax and semantics. It takes like 2 seconds to look it up. So it's not going to be a problem. Yeah, Jack?
What's the difference between them?
Syntax and semantics? Semantics are the special words, like the reserved words. And syntax, the keywords. Yep, the
That are
keywords.
specifically for that language?
That are specifically for that language. So does anybody know some of the keywords in Ruby? If, and did you say end? Yeah. Yes. Yes. So in Ruby we use end, the word end, E-N-D, to denote the end of certain constructs like method definitions and if statements and loops. We use the keyword end. Does anybody know some other special words in Ruby? While is a special word in Ruby, and it also is one that's common across multiple languages. The syntax of a while loop in Ruby will be slightly different than the syntax of a while loop in other languages. How about some other ones? Say again? Unless. Yep, that's another one. Unless. Case. Yep. Yep. So we have keywords, which are also, you'll see, referred to as reserved words. So we have end, if. We tried to write if and else at the same time. Else, while, until. What else did we say? Did we say any other ones? Does anybody know some other ones?
Def.
Def. Do you know what def is for?
It's for fun functions.
That's right. Called methods in Ruby. Yes, but I'll say functions all the time. Return. Yeah, you can say return. You can say return, I think, in every language. Ruby is, so do you know what you use return for? Anybody? Yeah. Use it to return to the caller. So if you're in a method or a function in another language, you can say return in some value or just return by itself, and that will return whatever value you specify to the caller of this function or method. If you say return from the main program, then it will exit the program and return whatever you tell it to return. Now, an interesting thing in Ruby is you don't have to ever type the word return in Ruby if you don't want to. You don't have to explicitly return from a method in Ruby, which drives me crazy. I don't like it. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. In Ruby, it will implicitly return the last thing that was evaluated, which can be surprising sometimes.
What does that mean?
So we'll leave it for the moment, because I'll talk in detail about it, and it'll come up over and over again.
Puts?
So, puts, yes. And actually, puts isn't really a keyword. Do you know what puts is?
Is it an acronym?
I think puts, is puts a method?
Put string.
Is it a method?
I consider it just like a log method, essentially.
I think it's a method and not really a keyword. I'm pretty sure it's a method.
It'd be nice if they use brackets with parameters.
But we don't call it on anything.
Yeah,
So
it's, I mean, that's just the usage case. I
yeah,
suppose. It's
I'm gonna
essentially
look
a method.
puts up, because we also have something that goes that we think of with puts that receives user input. Does anybody know that one?
Get
Yes.
strings.
What do you have, Jai?
I haven't got anything, but I was just going to ask you if we could take a photo of the board
Absolutely.
after we're done writing everything out.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yes. Yes. See you, Marcia. Can we think of any other keywords? How about do?
Does coexist in Ruby?
I don't know if it does.
Also,
They use end of month, don't they?
yeah, 4 as well as
4.
Right?
Yeah.
Elsa.
Mm-hmm. And in Ruby, it's written like this, ELSIF. And other languages, you might write else and then if. And in Shell, I think, it's ELIF, ELIF. But in Ruby, it's ELSIF without the E, all one word, ELSIF in Ruby. So those are some good ones. I'll find, there's a link to all of the reserved words in Ruby. I'll find that and send it up to you so you have it. So the thing to know about reserved words is you cannot use these as variable names or method names. Does that make sense? I mean, can you understand why you wouldn't? Because then the interpreter's like, huh? What?
So you're trying to do that action?
Yeah, it'll think you're trying to do that action. So you can't use those as variable names or method names. Okay. Syntax. The words, symbols, and layout pattern of programming statements. So even our spoken languages, of course, have syntax, right? Especially when when we write them down, right? There's syntax. We use full stops and question marks and commas and things like that. And we can understand people who speak our native language or languages that we know because we recognize the syntax, right? And programming languages are the same. You just have to recognize the syntax and the semantics. So here's just some examples of differences in syntax between Java, not JavaScript, Java, and Ruby. So what we have here is a method declaration in both cases, okay? So if we look on the Ruby side, we indicate that we're defining a method with the keyword def. That's what def does. Def is used to say, I'm going to define a method now. And we indicate that we're done defining that method with the keyword end. So between the def and the end are the contents of the method in Ruby. Now, we only have to give the method a name. That's all that's required. It just has to have a name. We don't have to say anything about what it returns. We don't have to say anything about its scope, as in who's allowed to execute it. We just have to give it a name. We don't have to give it an argument list if it doesn't have any arguments. We don't have to put empty parentheses at the end. We can just write it like that. And Ruby interpreter's like, yeah, I understand you. I got you. Yeah, John?
So if you use process data as the name, can you call back on that by just typing in that name and will it show you the function?
No, if you type process data, it will execute the content of that method. That's what it'll do. So it'll execute this. Data.all.each do. Okay, so let's just talk about at the method level still. In Java, we indicate we're defining a method by indicating first its scope, public, private, or protected, then indicating the return type, void or int or string or some object type. Void means it returns null. Then the name of the method, and then the argument list. And if there's an empty argument list, we have to put empty parentheses. So Java, you can see, is a very opinionated language. So it puts some real constraints on the way, with its syntax. You have to write things in a very specific way. The way you denote the start of a method in Java is with an open curly brace, and it must be there. And you denote the end of the method with a closed curly brace, which is here. So you have to have the curly braces. That's required. Now, if we look at the next bit, we have, does anybody know what kind of construct this is? This data.all.each do? Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, it's a loop. It's a loop. So this is going to loop through all the elements of data and do stuff. And the end of a loop in Ruby is denoted with the word end. The end of everything in Ruby, a loop, a method, a conditional is denoted with the word end. So if we contrast that to Java, in Java we have a loop, we have a do-while loop, which is another kind of loop. And again, we have to use curly braces to say where it starts and where it stops. And then we have the content inside of them. Let's look at the if statements. On the Ruby side, we have if data less than 0. So here's the condition that we're checking. We don't have to put parentheses around it. We just write it out there. That's happy. And we denote the end of the if block with the word end. In Java, we have to use the parentheses to denote the conditional that we're checking. Okay? And we don't have to use curly braces if there's only a single line in the block, but if there's more than one line, then we have to use curly braces. In Java, also notice what's something that's on the Java side that's not on the Ruby side. Just in general.
Or the semicolon.
The semicolons. So Java, you must use semicolons to denote the end of the line. In Ruby, you do not use semicolons.
There's no, there are only, the underscores, they're gone. Also, the underscores and the
Yes,
fact that it uses
that's good to
the
notice.
actual numeral instead of having to type out 1 or 2.
Yes, so this is not a matter of syntax, like required syntax, but a matter of convention, which is another thing that we need to pay attention to. So conventions are not required. The program will work whether you follow conventions or not, but we follow conventions so that when people look at our code, it's more readable. So we all decide that when we're writing code in Ruby, we're going to use these conventions. So I know if I look at some code, I can tell just by the way the code's written, this is Ruby. And I can tell just by the way that this thing is written, that's a variable, or that's a class definition, or that's whatever it is. So in Ruby, the convention is that method and variable names are snake case. Have you heard that before? Snake case. Snake case is when you use underbars and you write each word all lowercase with underbars between the words. And it's called snake case, I think, because it gets really long. It's really long. You've got extra characters in these underbars between each word. Are they the snakes?
Yeah.
Maybe. That's
They're
what
on
it
the
is.
ground.
They're on the ground. Okay. See, in my mind, I always thought, oh, it just gets really long when you have snake case. But yeah, that makes sense too. Those are the snakes. In Java, you use camel case for method names and variable names. Camel case, like a camel, starts with a lowercase letter, and every word is a capitalized letter, so it's like the humps of the camel, right? So that's camel case. And yesterday we saw, do you remember the case we saw yesterday? Kebab case. And you get, yeah, so kebab case is when the words are on a skewer, and you get the dashes in between. And then there's one more case that starts with a capital letter, and every word is capitalized. And that's called Pascal case. So class names, both in Java and in Ruby and in every language I've ever known, class names are Pascal case. So don't worry about memorizing all of this right now. You'll see these conventions practiced in every example that you look at. You just need to follow these conventions.
So what is a class name?
A class name? So a class is something you define, just like you define a method. You can define a class, and there's certain keywords to define a class. One of those is class. So when you define a class, you say class, class name, and you end the class declaration, guess what, with what in Ruby? What do you think ends with? End, yes. So a class declaration in Ruby also ends with end, and the class name, though, would be Pascal case. So it starts with a capital letter, and every word is capitalized. Okay? So right now it's just noticing that there are a lot of differences in the syntax, but the constructs are the same. So in both cases, we're defining a method. In both cases, we have a loop. In both cases, we have a conditional and if statement with an else inside of the loop. It's all the same logically. These two things would be doing the same thing, but it's just written differently. Another difference is that the variables in Java must be typed. You have to declare the type of a variable. When you initialize or declare a variable, you must declare the type in Java. But you don't have to do that in Ruby. In fact, you can't do that in Ruby. You don't do that in Ruby. The way that you define what data type a variable is by what you assign to it. And you can change that if you want to. So you can say data equals, in quotes, hello. Data is a string. And then you can say data equals 6. Now data is a number. And Ruby's totally fine with that. It doesn't mind, okay? Java would be like, oh hell no, we don't do that here. You defined it as an int. It can only be an int. You cannot assign a string to data because you have told me data is an int. And that's because when Java allocates memory, it allocates memory for exactly the size that data type needs. When Ruby allocates memory, it would do it differently. It either allocates the biggest possible memory, or maybe it allocates memory in a way that it can allocate more memory to that space if it needs to. Yeah,
So
John.
would Java be more efficient than Ruby faster? If it
In
allocates
some
certain-
cases, it will be. So that's a really complicated question, and there are a lot of things that are involved with it.
Just by what I heard, is that
But yeah.
with what you said, that it restricts the amount of data that it sets to something.
Yes. And if we talked about C, for example, in C we actually explicitly allocate the memory when we declare a variable. So we declare the type, and we actually allocate the memory by calling a method to allocate the memory for that variable. And then we have to remember to free up that allocation when we're done using that variable. And when we don't remember to do that, then we have a memory leak. And the program crashes our machine eventually. So Ruby is very friendly because it doesn't expect much of us syntactically. Syntactically, it's super forgiving. It's not very demanding. He's like, you know, semicolons, don't bother. It's okay. I know what you mean. It's like parentheses, it's okay. Don't need them. Don't bother. I know what you mean. So, and when this language was invented, that's what he was thinking. He was like, look, I know you know what you're doing. I trust you, programmer. You've been programming for a while. You know what you're doing. You don't have to type in the parentheses and the semicolons and the curly braces. You know, it's fine. We're going to trust you to write good code. So, now, for that reason, people argue it's not the best language to teach people who are just learning how to code. But we are going to make sure that we focus on writing nice, clean code that's well commented, that follows all the right conventions, so that we're putting in that structure ourselves, okay? We're just disciplining ourselves without having the language having to slap us on the hand for not using curly braces and semicolons. Okay, we talked about this. So look, I want to see you using all the right conventions, and I'm just going to tell you when you're not, okay? When you're not using the right conventions, when you're not using the right casing and things like that, I'm just going to point it out to you and say, okay, you should be using snake case here, or you should be using Pascal case here, just so that you don't, so you don't embarrass yourself. Yeah, and you present code out there in the world. But it's important because it makes the code more readable. So, okay, we wrote up some of these data types. Dates, you'll grow to hate dates. Dates are so tricky. Sometimes we have to use them. We looked at strings. Lists are very important data type. So what are some kinds of lists? Does anybody know? An array is a list. And that's the one that we'll use the most. We'll use arrays a lot. There's also sets in Ruby. Say again? Hash. A hash is also a list. Is there what? A switch is over here. Do we have, is it switch?
Case and when.
It's case and when, you're right. Case. Those are reserved words. Yes?
Are they on ordered and unordered lists?
I don't know. There might be. I'd have to look at the docs to see if they're explicit ordered and unordered lists. Yeah. But underneath, though, that would be the implementation. It would just be an array, and it would be implemented in a way to do that. Boolean. Does everybody know what a Boolean is? I mentioned it kind of in passing. Booleans are important because we use them in conditional statements and in loops to terminate. So I'm a fan of using basic data types as much as possible and not using parts of the elements of libraries that are like enhanced data types, like ordered lists, for example. And the reason is because if I use a primitive sort of data type, then I know how it's behaving. So if I use an ordered list, for example, I don't know what it's doing to make that ordered list. You know, I imagine that there's some looping going on there that I can't see, that's putting things in order. You know, so I don't know the performance characteristics of this thing when it's some kind of enhanced data type. And coming from my background of working in high performance computing, where I worked really close to the operating system and I was always really concerned about how things are being stored in memory and how quickly they're running on the machine, I like to stick with really basic data types and build my own classes if I want to build something, to do something, you know, that's going to be useful for me to reuse, but I'm going to build the class so that I know the performance characteristics of that class. But that said, I'm just telling you that because that preference and that bias will come out in my teaching. That said, there's nothing wrong with going and look at the Ruby docs, and if you find something that's going to do some of the work for you, you know, and give you less code to write, then by all means use that if that's what you want to do, okay? So one example is a matrix. Do you know what a matrix is? Anybody know what a matrix is? Not like the movie, but like the...
Or is it an array of numbers that are just like in a grid?
That's right. It's a two-dimensional array. It's an array inside of an array. So in a matrix, and this is one of those fancy enhanced data types, and there is a Ruby gem that implements one. In a matrix, it's something like, this is what it looks like. So you might have, you know, 0, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. It's an array of arrays. That's what a matrix is. I would rather deal with arrays than use a matrix class. So just as an example, because I don't know what they're doing, you know. I don't know how nice their algorithms are. And, yeah.
Would you represent that in an array?
So this would be an array inside of it'd be an array of arrays, yes. Yes, you would represent it as an array of arrays. Yes. And we will get to do that before you know it. You'll have some arrays of arrays. It'll be exciting and fun. Yeah. Okay, so what time is it? Are you guys tired? I've been talking for a while. We might stop there for the moment. It's only 2, but I think what we'll do